Real quick, I wrote a book. It's sci-fi, neither woke nor anti-woke, and it answers the question of what happens when an insubordinate, a nerd, and a hippie alien try to stand up to an invincible spacefaring army. In short, hilarity ensues. The book is called Perfect Worlds, and it's up on Amazon right now. You'll find ebook, paperback, and hardcover editions. I hope you enjoy it, but if you don't, that's totally my fault. Alright, we picked on Marvel one time, so let's get back to picking on DC. This is Superman Returns, and what happens when we try to move Superman's return. I remember hearing or reading an interview with Superman Returns director Bryan Singer, in which he said that if he could do it over, he would move Superman's rescue of the passenger airliner to earlier in the film, to get to Superman's return a bit quicker. Can this move be done, and what good would it accomplish? Let's find out. In my opinion, the reason to move up the passenger airliner rescue scene would be because there seems to be a lot to sit through for the first half hour of the film, before we even see Superman in action. First, we see Lex Luthor swindling an old lady to take her wealth as she dies. Then we see Kal-El crash landing on his mother's farm in Smallville. Then we see Lex traveling to the Fortress of Solitude to learn the secrets of the Kryptonian crystals. Then we see Clark waking up on the farm. Then we see Clark remembering that time when he discovered that he could fly. Then we see Clark being mean to his dog. Then we see Clark talking to his mother about feeling alone in the universe. Then we see Clark deciding to return to Metropolis. We see Jimmy Olsen greet Clark and welcome him back. We see Lois Lane covering a story on a passenger airliner about a new type of space shuttle launch. We see that Lois has won a Pulitzer Prize for an article she wrote called Why the World Doesn't Need Superman, and get some exposition from Jimmy Olsen about some of the changes that have occurred since Clark has been gone, including the fact that
fearless reporter Lois Lane is a mommy.
Then, as Lex shows off what the Kryptonian crystal can do, Jimmy and Clark hit a bar and have a drink to start their day at work as Jimmy tells Clark that Lois may still be in love with Superman. Of course, Lex's crystal demonstration causes a power outage that causes a problem with the launch, and Superman sees that Lois is in need of saving, and that is when we arrive at the scene of Superman rescuing the passenger airliner. And while that's a lot to get through, I feel like the problem with the first 30 minutes of Superman Returns really isn't that Superman doesn't show up early enough to make things interesting, as Bryan Singer implied. There's simply not much happening that's very interesting, and that's because there are a few elements in this first 30 minutes that really don't connect very well. For example, we don't need to see that since Superman's disappearance, Lex Luthor lost all his wealth, and now he's getting some wealth back. This scene implies a problem, Lex has no wealth, but also shows the solution to that problem, Lex reacquires wealth. So the scene is completely unnecessary. It's just something we have to sit through and inevitably ask the questions, why can't we simply believe that Lex is wealthy as he's always been? Why do we have to see that Lex lost his wealth? Since it doesn't add to the film, then it subtracts from the film, and that's why we can replace this scene with a scene that does add to the film. There's an entire scene cut from the film that depicts Kal-El aboard a Kryptonian spaceship searching through Krypton's remains. And not only is it an interesting scene, at the very least visually, but it also connects to a later scene after Kal-El crash lands on Earth, wakes up, and talks to his mother.
Did you find what you were looking for?
I thought, hoped, it might still be there.
You're home.
That place was a graveyard. I'm all that's left.
Okay, so we have an alternate start to the film, and what we want to do now is focus on building on top of this element as well as adding elements that matter to the story, and at the same time, we won't bog things down with useless exposition. So now that our alternate cut has its first scene, we need to figure out what happens after the opening credits. Do we go to the scene of Kal-El crashing back to Earth, which builds on the first scene of the film, or do we introduce a new element related to the story, which is the scene of Lex Luthor traveling to the Fortress of Solitude to discover the secret of the crystals? What we usually do to answer a question like this is look at each scene to see how well they would fit together, like a puzzle. For instance, if we start with Lex on the yacht, and that scene ends with Lex saying,
"Tell me everything, starting with crystals."
Then we move to Kal-El crash landing on Earth. We would see a weakened Kal-El in his mom's arms, and the next scene would have Clark waking up in his bedroom. That's okay, but we really wouldn't feel a passage of time there, would we? And that's something we need to think about when we're editing, how time is passing between scenes. So, after the opening credits, we'll show Kal-El crashing back to Earth, ending with a weakened Kal-El in his mother's embrace. Then we'll move on to Lex on his yacht, adding in a deleted scene that shows a bit more of Lex's shaky relationship with his partner, Kitty.
Oops.
Thank you, Kitty.
Lex then travels to the Fortress of Solitude to learn the secrets of the Kryptonian crystals, and the end of that scene will transition us to Clark waking up in his bedroom having recovered from his space endeavor, which shows a passage of time. We'll then add another deleted scene back in, one that allows us to remove a bit of Jimmy's exposition later in the film. After he wakes up on the farm, Clark finds a newspaper containing the article Why the World Doesn't Need Superman, which he takes the time to read. This would obviously have more of an impact on him, since he would be reading Lois's argument for why the world doesn't need him, versus simply seeing a headline on an award. And because he's hurt by this article, Clark can express his desire not to return to Metropolis, which he does in another deleted scene that we would also place back into the film.
Are you planning on heading back to Metropolis?
I was thinking about sticking around the farm. It wouldn't take me very long to repaint the barn and replant the fields.
What about that girl you used to like? Lois Lane. The one you had me send all those postcards to? I have to admit, I got pretty good at signing your name. The world can always use more good reporters.
And Martha's last line in that scene is a great transition to Lois's first scene in this film, which is as a reporter covering the space shuttle test launch.
The world can always use more good reporters.
The original space shuttle generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust just in the initial launch phase. But by piggybacking on this Boeing 777, yes.
If this launch is as pivotal as you claim, why is it only being covered by one news network?
Not to mention, Clark's decision to stay on the farm allows us to keep Clark on the farm for the time being, while Lex Luthor's experiment with a Kryptonian crystal causes a blackout that leads to the failure of the space shuttle launch, which in turn, with a small addition of Clark watching television, combined with the voiceover of the breaking news concerning the troubled launch, brings Superman back to action.
This is UPV Breaking News. From Washington, Frank Jacobs.
We've just received word that the inaugural flight of the Genesis space shuttle is experiencing a mid-air emergency.
Problem with the launch of the new orbital shuttle Genesis. But reports are telling us that the shuttle failed to disengage, sending both craft rocketing towards space.
We're now going live to Cape Canaveral for the latest update on this story.
Jim, all we know right now is that the couplings which hold the shuttle to the 777 malfunctioned and did not release as planned. We're uncertain as to why the ignition sequence continued.
So, rather than the original edit showing Clark sitting in a bar in Metropolis while Clark sees that Lois is in need of a rescue, this alternate version shows Clark at the farm in Smallville as he debates whether the world, read Lois Lane, needs him or even wants him around.
This is UPV Breaking News. From Washington, Frank Jacobs.
We've just received word that the inaugural flight of the Genesis space shuttle is experiencing a mid-air emergency.
Of course, Clark being Clark, he can't just sit back and watch a disaster occur, which leads to Superman's big return.
What the hell is that?
There's some kind of unidentified bogey coming in from the north.
Roger that.
And it's coming in fast.
And as a result of these changes, Clark returning to Metropolis has been moved to after the passenger airliner rescue, so we can focus on bringing Superman back into action first. And now it'll appear as if Clark's first day back on the job
Okay, everybody, listen up. I want to know it all, everything. Olsen, I want to see photos of him everywhere.
Coincides with Perry White wanting the Daily Planet to be all about Superman, which turns out to be a nice way of making it seem as if no one really notices Clark coming back at the same time as Superman, because everyone is so focused on Superman. So let's review what we did here. We removed a creepy opening scene with Lex Luthor taking an old lady for all she's worth, a scene that never explains why the old lady decided not to include her family members in her will, by the way. And we replaced it with an interesting scene of Kal-El searching through the remains of his home planet Krypton. We also removed Jimmy Olsen's unnecessary expositions, which are pretty much examples of "and then this happens" storytelling. These Jimmy Olsen scenes interrupt the natural flow of the story with "and then Clark returns to Metropolis," where Jimmy catches him up on events that have occurred in his absence, as well as "and then Clark and Jimmy are sitting in a bar to give Jimmy a chance to tell Clark that he thinks Lois is still in love with Superman." That piece of dialogue, however, messes up the idea that Lois may have moved on since Superman disappeared, and that's why removing that specific line is beneficial to the overall story. Also, we removed the scene of the city model as it was destroyed by the growing crystal.
Is that it?
I don't think so.
Dual engine failure, but they're up and running again.
After all, we don't pay exorbitant theater ticket prices to see a small city model get wrecked.
Is that it?
I don't think so.
Dual engine failure, but they're up and running again.
Altogether, by removing any unneeded exposition and replacing those scenes with deleted scenes that contain the same information that is shown to us rather than told to us, we're giving the first 30 minutes of this film a much better flow, with a more interesting story to follow. And every element within the first 30 minutes of the alternate cut is connected. And the funny thing is that even with all these changes, that scene of Superman flying in to save the doomed passenger airliner appears in our alternate cut at just about the same time as it does in the original theatrical cut of the film. So Bryan Singer's regret that Superman's first action scene isn't earlier in the film really shouldn't be a regret.
Regret is for suckers, for suckers, for suckers. Regret is for suckers.
What the first 30 minutes of Superman Returns needed was less exposition, less telling, and more showing of Clark discovering the changes that have occurred since he's been gone. Speaking of which, remember that piece of information Jimmy gives to Clark and the audience?
Fearless reporter Lois Lane is a mommy.
In our alternate cut, this information now comes after Superman has rescued Lois from the potential passenger airliner crash and returned to his job at the Daily Planet as Clark Kent. And the best part about cutting Jimmy's exposition out of the film is that without this spoiler, the first time Clark and the audience find out how much Lois's life has changed would be right here.
Did you take your vitamins?
Yes.
Eye drops?
Yes.
Albuterol?
Yes.
Polybiflor?
Yes, Mom.
Good boy. He's a little fragile, but he's going to grow up to be big and strong, just like his dad, won't you? Yes?
Yes.
And now that we've met one of the new men in Lois's life, a child who Clark thinks Lois had with someone else, let's meet the other man.
Where's the little guy? Hey, kiddo. Ugh, how are you?
Can you work some family magic to get your uncle to stop giving me such a hard time on this article? Please?
Again?
Again.
Again. How are you, kiddo?
Oh, this is Clark.
Oh.
Clark, Richard, Clark.
Richard White. Hi.
Do you see how much better that works? Rather than simply see Clark crack the glass of a picture frame after being told of the two new men in Lois's life, we now feel Clark's surprise as he meets a boy who Lois appears to be taking care of before Lois talks to and kisses another man who appears to be the boy's father. In other words, we, the audience, are now experiencing the changes that have occurred in Clark's absence along with Clark. And when we experience the impact of those changes with the character, we can feel closer to what the character is feeling when he's feeling it. And that is how we can make Superman Returns a bit more interesting.